Okay. Welcome everyone. I'll keep my introduction very short because I think we really want to hear Deepak this evening. Very briefly, like Megha said, that about 8 years ago, I had this opportunity to sort of visit Mizoram for almost a couple of months. I think we were there for about between 6 and 8 weeks. And that is a time that I got introduced to this idea. And I remember at the time calling another common friend of ours, both Deepak's and mine, Professor Shori Chaudhary, who used to be at the Itanagar Rajiv Gandhi University, where I think Deepak has also been in the past, and asked him, that, this is such a sort of intriguing situation, because we were photographing in the Chittagong, in the Indian side of the Chittagong hill tracks, on the sort of eastern bank of the Kornopuli River, and documenting village by village these this community called the Chakmas. And I really needed to get my head around what was going on. And at that point of time, Shorida sort of referred me to Deepak's work. And I remember literally coming back to Calcutta and picking up that book, and it was such a sort of insightful experience. In the series that we are working on currently at the History for Peace project, where we are looking at various untold, unheard of stories from partition, we therefore felt that this is also something that is extremely important for us to discuss. Very briefly, though, Deepak's credentials go into many pages. Deepak is currently an associate professor at Punjab University in Chandigarh. He completed his PhD back in 2004. He has published extensively, received several fellowships and scholarships, such as the New India Foundation Fellowship for his book in 2005 and 6, the UIC Associateship at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies in Shimla, before that in 2000-2003, and the ICCR Teacher Doctoral Fellowship in 1998-1999. Of course, his most notable book is Stateless in South Asia, which is something that we would be referring to this evening, and numerous other papers that he has published on the subject. I will really not go into the details of it because that will be a very long list. I think, Deepak and I have also been discussing how to sort of broach this subject. And I think the first thing that is very important to people like us, trained as anthropologists, is also the manner or the context in which we find ourselves at a particular location, or decide to engage with a particular location, and sometimes make it our life's work. So if I may, Deepak, as an introduction, because this might also give us a more personalized view of you rather than your publications and awards that I was reading out, that would you like to start by telling us how or in what manner did you sort of find yourself amidst the Chakma communities of the Arunachal, how you sort of placed yourself and your research within them, and then we move on to some of the other ideas that we shall cover in this talk.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Abeer, for all the nice words. I'm glad that you have raised this question because, it was sheer, something went wrong. Okay, am I audible, Megha?
Just switched off my video so that people can focus on yours.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Is that okay now? Okay, fine. You have switched yourself off. That's the reason. Okay. Coming back to how did I get into doing this piece of work, which I have, worked on. Actually, it was sheer serendipity, to be honest. It was way back in the 1992 that I had got my first job in Arunachal University, and I was fairly young at that time, 24 years old. So I landed up in Arunachal with a job, and then I came across this problem there because from the perspective of the indigenous peoples in Arunachal, it was a very serious problem. And it was about 1996, if I'm not mistaken, when the Supreme Court of India had come out with a verdict on the future of this community of people. And I happened to then just write a small piece of paper, which I published somewhere in a very obscure journal relevant but obscure journal. It's called Revolutionary Democracy, published from Delhi. And then I happened to show that paper to my supervisor here in Punjab University. And he somehow liked the idea very much. He said, why don't you work on this? Because this is a very good theme to work on. And I said, my God, how does one write a PhD thesis on a problem on which there is hardly any data available? And I would get nightmares, literally, because I just couldn't believe that, somebody can write a full-fledged thesis on this. But to cut the story short, here I am. I have managed to write my doctoral thesis on this, and then it was eventually published subsequently. Now, but I just would like to share a few things here, which is very important from the point of view of ethnographic work that I ended up doing. People kind of find it very intriguing that how come with political science background, I could manage to do a work like this. It so happened that, when I got interested in the whole problem, I could hardly find any literature on the problem, apart from some newspaper clippings and things like that. So once I kind of made up my mind that I need to work on it, I had to fall back upon the framework of oral history or oral narratives, because, I personally believe that, given the nature of the problem, particularly from the vantage point of both the refugees themselves and also the actually hosting community in Arunachal, there was no other way of doing this work than going down to the people, living with them, talking with them, trying to reconstruct history from their vantage point. And that really helped. That really helped in a big way to kind of, make sense of the issues, and also kind of look at the issues from the viewpoint of both the refugees as well as the host community. And when I'm going to talk in the next 30-40 minutes, it will become clear that how what makes the problem a very serious, very complex problem is the fact that both the principal parties to the problem, the Chakma refugees on the one hand and the indigenous peoples on the other, have very legitimate, concerns. And sadly enough, one of the things which I have realized by doing this work is that when we look at scholarship on refugees, invariably, always you would find that the focus is mostly on one aspect of the problem, which is, most of the studies are refugee centric, without at all trying to understand, what could be the other side of the story, the story of the host community. And here I want to make a point very quickly before I'll ask Abeer to kind of pose the next question, which is that, it's very rarely that, sorry, let me come back to it. The point that I basically wanted to make here is that if we look at the stay of the Chakma refugees in Arunachal Pradesh since 1964, it is only notional that the Chakmas have been living in India, right? That the Indian state has provided them refuge. While it is fully true that the Indian state did provide them refuge, and that's a separate story. But the fact of the matter is that who have all these years actually ended up hosting these people? It is the people of Arunachal who have hosted these people, and hence their story must also be heard, right? So that was my whole approach to this problem. And as a researcher, I thought that unless I bring to table both the sides of the story, it's not going to help, right? So, I just thought I would make this brief, kind of qualifier here, and then, go on. So again, Abeer, please. You are not audible. Yeah,
absolutely, because we were hoping to sort of move from this point, by contextualizing the talk in this way, move on then to the next idea, which is to kind of introduce to some of the people, because again, this is a subject that very few people might even be very familiar with, because very little, like you said, appears either in in let's say popular media or even scholarship. Very very little work has been done on this. So would you please introduce to us, some of the dynamics that are involved with the Chakmas? I mean, of course, your focus, or the focus of today's talk, are the Chakma refugees in Arunachal, but of course there are other pockets of them living in in sort of
Mizoram,
Western.
Tripura, yeah.
So please, would you kind of introduce it to us, and perhaps also take the opportunity to speak about that very intriguing word that you used, that this state of liminality, this sort of state of limbo, that the community and the culture is facing at the moment. Yeah.
Okay. See, like, I mean, let me put it like this. When we look at the history of the Chakma people in the Chittagong Hill tracts, is a very complex, multi-layered history. Okay, there are different aspects to the issue of the Chakma people, both within the CHT as well as in the points of their diaspora, say in Mizoram, Tripura, Arunachal. But my work essentially concerns with the Chakma refugees who had to take refuge in India way back in 1964. Okay. I would quickly like to kind of say one thing here, that when you look at the literature, whatever literature that is available, most of the literature focus on only one aspect of their displacement. And that particular aspect happens to be, the setting up of the Kaptai Dam. Okay. You very rightly said in your introduction that, the Karnafuli River. So in the dominant literature available on the Chakma refugees, they have come to be traditionally viewed as environmental refugees, okay, or let's say developmental refugees, okay, but that's only partly true, okay. What is very important about the plight and the subsequent flight of these people from Chittagong Hill tracts is the fact that they were subjected to political and religious persecution, both at the hands of the Pakistani regime when CHT became a part of Pakistan, and subsequently when East Pakistan was replaced by Bangladesh in 71, right? So the kind of aggressive nationalism, which they were subjected to, also left them no space, to kind of survive within Chittagong Hill tracts. The immediate trigger for their flight from CHT, of course, was the setting up of the Kaptai Dam, which had inundated 40% of their arable land, affecting about 1 lakh of people, of which a whopping 90% of them happened to be the Chakmas. Okay, so it was a combination of different factors put together which pushed them out of Chittagong Hill tracts. And since they had no option, they kind of almost about 40,000 people had taken shelter in 64 in India. Luckily for them, Nehru, who was the prime minister in 64, promptly allowed them to come into India. But unfortunately for the Chakmas, the Nehru died the same year. Just after the Chakmas were allowed in, he also passed the very same year. We'll keep coming back to the history of the Chakmas and the whole story as such. But I'll get back to the point of liminality, which you mentioned. The reason I have termed this talk, because this talk actually is based on a paper published exactly with the same title in EPW. The reason I use the expression liminality is that how these people, right since the colonial times, right, have found themselves stuck in a vicious cycle of transition, with each stage of transition further worsening their lives. Okay, so there are people who have virtually been caught in a process of transition from one stage to another, and I can list out 7 such stages of transition which they have undergone till date, and their life worsening with each subsequent phase of transition. So that's the whole thing. So I just thought that I'll talk about each of those stages of transition that they have actually undergone till date. Okay, next thing, if
before we come to the transitions, shall we also kind of try and understand what is this sense of statelessness and rightlessness? Because I think as an experience, it can be quite different from what, like you said, it is on paper, or the kind of relationships that it develops with the host community and so on. And perhaps then we could go into that spiral of transition that we were discussing. Yeah.
Right. I mean, look, when we look at the whole process of a statelessness, one thing which is very important here is that, statelessness as a part of the larger human condition, or should I say inhuman condition, is more often than not both caused and maintained by the state. Okay, invariably always, invariably always, the state is the trigger for statelessness. Okay, and there are different circumstances under which statelessness can arise. Okay, it may so happen that a state chooses to kind of disown its minority ethnic groups with a view to making its dominant national population more homogeneous, right? Or it may also happen that a state may choose to kind of, deport certain groups of people from within its territory on the grounds of, political, cultural differences or religious differences, for example, right? Now, these are the grounds, and there are other grounds on which, people are invariably pushed out of certain territories. And we can, or in other situation, it may also so happen that, a group of people may actually choose themselves to leave the state of their origin because they perceive, serious threats to their lives and livelihoods. Okay, say for example, what happened in Tibet. Okay, it was a conscious decision by the people there to kind of run away. So it could be an escape from violence. It could be an escape from a development-induced displacement. It could be an escape from persecution. But I'm reminded here of Hannah Arendt, by the way, who in her seminal work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, actually captures a very nuanced understanding of the plight of such people. And she says, and I'm going to quote her here, she says, just a minute, let me just, might as well read that thing, why unnecessarily get it wrong. She says, to be stripped of citizenship is to be stripped of worldliness. It is like returning to a wilderness as a caveman or a savage. They could live and die without leaving any trace. Okay. Now that's the whole thing about statelessness. Is not merely the absence of a state in your life. It's not merely the fact that the guarantees of certain rights are not extended to you. Okay, but refugeehood or statelessness could be a condition which can also have a huge psychological toll on the psyche of the people, in addition to very serious social and economic conditions that they are put through, right? By the way, citizenship as a right in the modern times, in the contemporary human rights lexicon, has been called actually, the right to have rights. If one doesn't have this basic right of citizenship, no other rights would accrue, right? So in that sense, statelessness could be a very, very, excruciating, painful experience for those who do not have access to state and all the rights, which are extended to such people. Okay. Now coming more specifically to the issue of the Chakma refugees. Okay. What makes them stateless is the fact that ever since they took refuge in India way back in 1964, and the land they left in order to come to India was East Pakistan. It was in 71 when Bangladesh became a state, and they were very hopeful actually. And I'm not talking about these refugees who were already in Arunachal, but even back in CHT, the Chakmas who were there, with the change of guard at the center, at the center within Bangladesh, they were pretty hopeful that, you know, this new government, new state which has been formed, and has been formed after a long, you know, movement, popular nationalist movement, would perhaps be in a better position to appreciate their, you know, political, cultural aspirations. Okay, and I'm reminded of one of the meetings which Mujibur Rahman had held immediately after Bangladesh became an independent state, and when the CHT People's Association had submitted a plea to him, saying that, you know, now that there's a new state, we hope you would respect our distinct ethnicity. And Mujibur Rahman had kind of rebuked them by saying that, look, if you guys have to stay here in Bangladesh, you better become Bengalis, or else there is no space for you, right? Unleashing a reign of you know, terror, you know, all kinds of atrocities that they had to go through, and they continue to suffer till now. Okay, but coming back to the people who were all stuck in Arunachal in 71. You know, one unique thing about the whole story of the Chakma refugees is that they are probably the only group of refugees in the whole world, perhaps, okay, I'm not very sure about it, you know, who became stateless while in exile, right? 71, they were in Nefa. It was not even Arunachal, by the way. It became Arunachal only in 72, right? So till about 1971, it was called NEFA, and Northeastern Frontier Agency, which was directly governed from the center under the Ministry of Home. Okay, so this is an unique, you know, example of a people in which they had absolutely no say in the change of their political identity from refugees to stateless peoples. Okay, so their exilic status, you know, has continued till date. In the absence of a grant of citizenship by the Indian government. So they have no state in their lives, and they are nor are they citizens of India, making them stateless refugees. Okay. Okay, I'll stop here, and then maybe.
So, very interesting, because you mentioned Nepal, and earlier in the same conversation you mentioned Tibet. You know, we are slowly setting up, you know, for our viewers, you know, the context within which these people are located. So we spoke about the experience of liminality. It's worth mentioning, though I think you and I take it for granted, that, you know, they are also a Buddhist community. I mean, they are followers of Theravada. I mean, at least the communities that I met, which is also one of the points of conflict between Bangladesh, because it was not just a sort of ethnic cleansing mission of you know, sort of homogenizing them with a mainstream Bengali society, but it was also a clash between you know, the predominant Islam, you know, sort of followers of Islam in Dhaka, and these sort of tiny minority groups there. But one other point, which I think is worth, you know, sort of if you would sort of elaborate on that, is how this is also within the context of these extremely problematic political boundaries that have been drawn. I mean, we know that you mentioned it a little bit, but you know, with the separation, you know, with East Pakistan and then Bangladesh and so on. But you know, it's a strange thing that, you know, they are now in Arunachal. Exactly. They are sort of a neighboring state of China. You know, Tibet is close by, but, you know, that entire region. So would you just like to perhaps give us a few more insights onto the sort of space location of these people, and the kind of dynamics that come around it, before we kind of move forward into that spiral of those transitions that we were talking about?
I'm so glad you raised this, Abeer, because there is a very little known you know, fact about the plight of the Chakma refugees. Not only the Chakma refugees, but also the people who are stuck back in Chittagong Hill tracts. Okay, and this basically goes to the whole issue of the political boundary which you just raised. Okay, you know, the root of the crisis for the people of Chittagong Hill tracts, and, you know, not only Chakmas, but along with the Chakmas, there are about 11 other ethnic communities living in Chittagong Hill tracts for generations together. Um, you know, the basic root of the problem lies in the partition of India. Okay? Unfortunately, the literature on partition, and there is no dearth of literature on partition. Okay, there is a joke, which is in circulation in the partition studies circuit, if I can use that term, and that is that if we were to collect all the published work, both fiction, non-fiction, on partition of India, it would easily fill in a decent sized library. So much of work has been done. And unfortunately, these Chakma people, the impact of partition on their lives has not been looked into very seriously, apart from a few scholars, like I'm reminded of a scholar called Tan and Kudezia, their book called The Aftermath of Partition, which was published in 2000. Okay, and in my own book, I kind of I touch upon this theme, quite extensively, and the credit for that goes to the Chakma people themselves, because they helped me reconstruct their past. They helped me reconstruct. I mean, they did it themselves. I just recorded it. I just documented it. In one of the chapters in my book, basically, privileges their own voices, and it is through their voices that I try to reconstruct the past history. And then it becomes clear that how the fact that they have continued to suffer both within the CHT and in the points of their diaspora, particularly in Arunachal. The story in Mizoram and Tripura are very different. Okay, so we will not get into that. Is precisely because of the politics of partition. And I would like to kind of spend a couple of minutes here on this, because this is very, very significant. See, what happened was that if you look at the much touted two-nation theory, which was the basis for the partition of the subcontinent, according to which the non-Muslim dominant areas should have gone to India, and the Muslim dominant area should have gone to Pakistan. Okay. Now, CHT in 1947, 98% of its population was non-Muslim. Okay, 98%, and yet it was given to Pakistan. Now, there was a politics behind it, right? And the politics was that CHT was traded off to Pakistan in lieu of the Muslim dominant district of Firozpur in Punjab, because I know, as a result of a secret negotiations with the Sikhs of Punjab, right? Now it is that particular, that particular, development because of which the Chakmas have continued to suffer till now. Okay. Interestingly, I'm reminded of, a very important incident, which is that just about a week before the Radcliffe Award was announced, okay, the Chakmas in Rangamati were celebrating, and they had hoisted the Indian national flag, because they had assurances from people like Nehru himself, the first prime minister, and also the home minister Sardar Patel, that there is no question of Chittagong Hill Tracts ever going to Pakistan, and it would logically be part of India. But all those pleas kind of fell on deaf ears, and nothing happened. And these people kind of found themselves suddenly one night that they have become Pakistanis. Again, they had virtually no say in the change of their political identity. So one point which constantly comes up when we talk about the history of the Chakmas as a people is that in none of the transitions that they have undergone thus far, they have had any role to play. Okay. Again, there's an interesting story which I want to bring in here regarding the partition of India. This relates to the man who was summoned by the last Viceroy Mountbatten to come and draw the lines. Sir Cyril Radcliffe, as he's called. We can do away with Sir for the time being. You would be surprised to know that Radcliffe had never ever visited India before, until he was summoned for this job. One. Two, he was a lawyer by profession. He had no accomplished acumen in cartographic skills. Okay. And I'm going to share a couple of confessions made by, a confession made by himself. But before I come to that, this book that I just mentioned by Tan and Kudezia, they mention it in the book that Radcliffe knew it too well that his was a rushed job. Okay. No, Radcliffe knew it too well, that it was a butcher's job and not a surgeon's operation. They put it very nicely, you know. And then, you know, they also quote Radcliffe in the book, and this quote relates to one of the letters which he actually wrote to his stepson on the verge of his departure from India. And he wrote to his stepson saying that, you know, nobody is going to love me for this award of Punjab and the Bengal, and there would be roughly 80 million people who would start looking for me. And I mean, there would be 80 million people with a grievance who would start looking for me, and I do not want them to find me. Now, this is a kind of a self-confession by the man who actually came in and drew the line. Okay, there were all kinds of pressure on this man, Radcliffe, you know, to do the job as fast as possible. He was also pressured to kind of, I'm reminded again of, you know, another story. Somebody told me in Shimla, if you go to Shimla, the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, and if you go to the dining hall, the adjoining building, you know, the passage to the dining hall, on the first floor of the passage, you know, like there's a long hall, and maps from all over India, maps of the whole, you know, subcontinent were kind of hung on all the four sides of the wall. And this man was told to, you know, do the job, finish the job and go, right? Now, this basically shows the extent of haphazardness with which the lines were drawn, right? Leading to a situation that the Chakmas have continued to suffer till date, okay? So that's just the point which I wanted to make about, you know, this whole business of, you know, drawing the line, apart from other, you know, several problems which have been there.
Yeah. So, you know, just before we move forward, you know, for the convenience of our audience, you know, there are a lot of things that we are discussing today, which actually, you know, rings a very strong bell and is very topical to a sort of range of issues that surround us. You know, like when we were speaking about statelessness and the sort of insights that you provided us about citizenship and the right to have rights, for instance, is something that is, you know, very topical to a large number of communities that you know, are in the subcontinent. Subsequently, the idea of liminality itself, I mean, the idea of the state and how it sort of forcibly creates a sense of statelessness and so on, is also something that is very evident in this part of the world. Because, I mean, we are speaking to each other from across the Himalayas. I mean, right. Very recently, when you were speaking of Radcliffe and all of that, I was being reminded of, you know, the sort of fuzziness of the border that Ladakh has, for instance, with China, which is something that goes back several centuries, which, you know, it's a sort of unresolved situation. And again, a small insight that, you know, very often human cultures have a much better understanding of boundaries and borders, because again, we use the word border, but, you know, the idea of where Ladakh ends and where Tibet begins is sort of very strongly there in the consciousness of the people here. But again, we kind of tend to get embroiled in the sort of international politics of it, you know, and that causes another round of anyway. So as we were saying that, you know, a number of things that we've been discussing today are actually very topical. And I think the next and perhaps the concluding section of this talk, where, you know, I would request you to sort of very briefly run us through these transitions, you know, that they have gone through, you know, for us to just understand, you know, the gravity of the condition of these people. You know, and then maybe we can sort of open up a few questions, you know, for the audiences, if there are any.
Okay, fine. Look, I think I've already touched upon a few of these, but let me kind of put them in sequence. If we look at the series of transitions that these people have undergone, it predates independence of India. It goes back to the colonial times first. So the first transition that they underwent was from being self-governing autonomous communities to colonial subject population, right? It was only in 1860 that the Chakmas were brought, within the full ambit of the colonial rule. Before that, Chakma community, I mean, the different communities in Chittagong Hill Tracts constituted, self-sufficient economic, I mean, each community actually had a self-sufficient economic unit as well as a self-administered political unit, right? So it was only from 1860, with the extension of full colonial control over this region that, they became subject population for the first time. Okay. This was the first transition which happened. Now, again, when you look at the literature, there's a very interesting thing about this particular phase of transition. And that is that this particular phase when, the colonial rule was extended into this region, much of the literature and even in popular perception, retrospectively speaking, this phase today is looked upon as constituting the golden age in the lives of the Chakmas. And frequent references are made to, this particular, period in history, okay? Expressions like, colonial benevolence, is frequently deployed by scholars to say that, look, during the colonial times, they had considerable autonomy, which is all gone once they became a part of Pakistan or subsequently Bangladesh. Okay. What I want to quickly add here and move on to the next stage of transition is the fact that this whole talk about colonial benevolence is actually a myth. Okay. And what makes it a myth is the simple reason that the decision of the British colonial regime to keep away or to keep off from the region was propelled by very pragmatic calculations. The Britishers believed that, there's no point in unnecessarily intervening in the lives of these people, and they were content to kind of collect their regular taxes and not intervene. And they were allowed a certain degree of autonomy in the area of land ownership, or say, for example, some customary rights. And they were happy to just collect their taxes, and they didn't want to unnecessarily offend them, because, in case of backlash from such people, it would have unnecessarily entailed huge financial burden for the Britishers, and they were not interested in this. Okay. So this whole talk about colonial benevolence, is retrospectively constructed, and it is constructed precisely because of the fact that the history of these people from here on becomes so turbulent that in terms of governance, when you contrast the two periods, one says, oh, well, that those days were much better, but because, we were relatively happier, we had, greater autonomy and things like that. But that's only partly true. Okay. The Britishers had, the Britishers very, very clear in their minds that they did not want to unnecessarily, involve themselves, with the people and region, which would not, so they were very content with their economic, profit which they were making, and the chieftains had willingly agreed to pay the regular taxes. So that is one part. Now, moving on to the next stage of I mean, what I'll do, Abeer, is like, these are fairly long stories, each of these. So I'll just kind of keep it to the minimum, highlight the major, things and then move on. And towards the end, actually, if time permits, I would be very happy to kind of, try and offer some kind of a solution to this problem, which I have really kind of, I mean, tried to hammer out some kind of a solution. It may or may not be possible, but that's a different thing. Let's move to the second stage of transition, which is from subject population to Pakistani nationals. And this is something which we have already touched upon, that how in 1947, they became Pakistani nationals. And while they were, grappling with the idea of living as reluctant citizens, a new development starts in their lives, which is when the Pakistani government, starts in a very systematic manner, in a very systematic manner, it starts transferring people from the mainland Bangladesh, the relatively poorer Bengali, the relatively landless poorer Bengalis into the CHT with all kinds of cash incentives basically with a view to, diluting their, moral political claim to constituting a distinct people. These are very standard, technique which is followed by, different countries. It was followed by China in the case of Tibet, right? A very similar thing was followed in the case of Chittagong Hill Tracts, when, systematic transfer of people from the mainland Bangladesh started. And you would be obviously knowing it that, from 98%, according to 2011 census, it was 51-49. It might have now exceeded. I don't know. I don't have the current data, right? So it was a very systematic, ethnic cleansing design kind of a thing. Okay, so that's the in the second, phase of transition. The third phase is also kind of related to the second, in the sense that, once they became Pakistani citizens, they were also rejected by the Pakistani government, right? They were not allowed to kind of have any autonomy or any kind of freedom which they wanted as a people on the basis of distinct ethnicity and all. And there are a lot of stories, of religious, political persecution, but we will not get into that here. Rejected peoples, by the way, is a category which is used by Myron Wenner, the famous scholar on demography, politics, and things like that, who wrote the famous book Sons of the Soil. And the way he defines rejected peoples fits in squarely with the story of the Chakma refugees, or the Chakma people, not only the refugees, the whole Chakma people living in CHT. Let me quickly move now again from rejected people. The next phase of transition is when, their life once again underwent a change and they became internally displaced people. Again, something which we have talked. So under this phase, I talked, transition from rejected peoples to internally displaced people. This is something I'll skip because we have already talked about it. Now, yet another transition that they underwent is when they became stateless peoples from refugees. When they came to India in 1964, they took asylum. They were refugees, call them environmental refugees, developmental refugees, whatever. By 71, they became, another label got prefixed to their identity, and they became stateless refugees. Okay, so let's kind of quickly move on from here. And the last transition that is important is from stateless refugees to unwelcome settlers. Okay, it's very important to point it out here that when they were settled in Nefa between 1964 and 69, right? The situation in Nefa was such that they did not have a representative government, right? They had weak civil society institutions. And because of these two factors, there was virtually no opposition to their settlement in Nefa, right? It is also important here to mention that Arunachal is a very unique state in India. If you look at the demographic composition of Arunachal, there are 26 major ethnic groups or groups of indigenous peoples. I refrain from using the term tribal because I find this term tribal highly problematic. It was a term which was purely an administrative, which was primarily used for administrative purposes by the colonial government. It doesn't tell us anything intrinsic about the lives of such people. Whereas when we use the term indigenous peoples, it is a political category. It has, it has very significant implications. So I normally do not use the term tribal, even though it is a legal term within the Indian Constitution. But let's not get into that. So the point here is that, it was only after, between 64 and 69, there was no scope for any opposition, right? By 1987, to cut it, to cut it to 1987, by 1987, what happens is that Nepal becomes a fully fledged state, right? Called Arunachal Pradesh. It became Arunachal Pradesh right way back in 72 when it became an union territory, and the full statehood was granted to 1987. Okay, now that's the point. That's the time. I mean, actually, the middle of 80s or beginning of 80s, the whole problem had started when the second generation of native Arunachalis, after gaining education and things like that, they became a little conscious, aware about, their rights and how, some of the existing laws in Arunachal were violated by settling such people in Arunachal. And then the different sections of people in Arunachal started opposing the settlement of the Chakmas in their state, because Arunachal is a unique state in India which continues to enjoy certain special safeguards which have been granted to it. The most notable of which is the Bengal Eastern Regulation, the Bengal Eastern Regulation Act, 1873. Okay, under this regulation, even a non-native Indian citizen cannot enter Arunachal without obtaining an inner line permit. This whole institution of inner line permit applies in the case of 3 states in India, in the Northeast: Nagaland, Mizoram, and Arunachal. Okay. Now the local people started saying that, look, when the existing laws of the land say that not even Indian citizens can come into our state and develop any long-term stakes, how come you allowed them to come into our state and settle them on our land? Okay. So what has happened over the years is that it is the land, it is the issue of land which has, become the most controversial issue. And there has been a popular movement going on in Arunachal. It's called Chakma Go Back movement, which is spearheaded by, the all-powerful students body there, which is called Arunachal Pradesh Students Union. Now, so suddenly what has happened is, over the years, after the settlement in Arunachal, they have become unwelcome, right? There is groundswell of resentment in Arunachal because they basically say that, and because with educational awareness and things like that, they have become politically very conscious, and they kind of invoke, they invoke certain rights which have been conceded to indigenous peoples across the world, saying that indigenous peoples have inalienable right over land, and their land cannot be taken away from them. And this particular ham-fisted approach of the Indian government in settling these people in Arunachal is not acceptable to us. So it is a very sensitive issue in Arunachal from the point of view of the people of Arunachal. Okay, and they just do not want. They actually have gone on record saying that, as far as citizenship is concerned, it is the prerogative of the Indian government to grant citizenship to them. Okay, we have no issues with that, but we will not let them be here. We will not let them, live on our land. Okay, let me also quickly add here that, during the settlement period of the Chakmas in Arunachal between 64 and 69, each Chakma family was granted or given 5 acres of wasteland. Okay, mind you, I'm using the word wasteland, forest areas and things like that. And on the basis of sheer hard work, sheer labor that the Chakmas put in, they have over the period, transformed the land into highly cultivable land. Okay, now that has become an eyesore for the local people there. Okay, so it is actually the dispute over land which is at the heart of the problem in Arunachal. One doesn't know, I mean, one doesn't know really what is going to happen. Okay, as far as, just allow me 2 minutes more, okay, and then I'll kind of stop. And as far as the citizenship, right of the Chakmas in Arunachal is concerned, the Supreme, I mean, there are several statutory bodies in India, starting with the Supreme Court of India, National Human Rights Commission, okay, Delhi High Court, Guwahati High Court, Election Commission of India. They have not only duly acknowledged the legitimate claim of the Chakmas over Indian citizenship, but they have also formally endorsed this right. The Supreme Court in particular, both in 1996 and again in 2015, came up with very strong, verdict saying that, they do have a legitimate right over Indian citizenship and it must be given to them. Okay. However, the Chakmas never got, this right until about 2004, when the Election Commission of India, by referring to the verdict of the Delhi High Court, okay, and the Delhi High Court, by the way, invoked a different provision within the Indian Citizenship Act, which is, Section 3(1)(a) of 1955 Citizenship Act, which says that those of the Chakmas who were born in India, after the settlement here, but before 1st July 1987, would become Indian citizens by birth, even if their parents were not citizens at the time of their birth. Okay, so this particular provision was invoked by the Election Commission of India in 2004, and some 1,497 odd Chakma refugees were enrolled in the voters list. Okay, so a barely 1.5% of the estimated 1 lakh Chakmas who are living in Arunachal were enrolled in the voters list. Okay, so that is one little part of it, but the rest of the people have continued to languish in a state of statelessness till date. Okay, I just thought that it is important to kind of give this information for the sake of, because like there's again a very interesting thing which I'm tempted to say. The 1996 Supreme Court verdict, which of course unambiguously talks about granting citizenship rights to the Chakmas, Chakmas of Arunachal, but that benefit could never be extended to the Chakma refugees. Okay, and ironically, even though the Chakma refugees have not benefited either from the 1996 Supreme Court verdict, nor from the 2015 Supreme Court verdict, the 1996 Supreme Court verdict in particular has gone on to attain the status of what is called a case law. It has become a case law. It's a technical term. I'll quickly explain it. A case law is a law, which for all future purposes can be invoked by the Supreme Court in similar situation, allowing the court to kind of stick to that decision and just announce its verdict. So there's not even a need for a formal hearing and things like that. So that kind of a status. But in reality, not even a single Chakma has been given citizenship under the 1996 verdict, nor the 2015 verdict. It was a different route that the Election Commission of India followed, and a very meager 1.5% of people were granted citizenship. I'll wait here and then kind of take questions from you.
Yeah. So I think I'm sure people in the audience also are in some ways interested in listening to the solution that you were speaking of. But before any of that, I would just address one small question that has come up from the Facebook page live stream. And, if you could just very, very briefly, because I suppose we should have started with this. However, the talk was not about their ethnic construction or profile. there's a question, if you see in the chat box, Deepak, where one of the members of the audience have requested us to very briefly give us a background of their religion and language and tradition. Now, it's again, these are very complicated words, like you were saying, about like the word tribal and so on. I already mentioned, for instance, that they were a sort of Buddhist community who, in fact, followers of the Theravada Buddhism, and the language and the script is also a very, very complex issue. I had the fortune of having a student while I was at a major university who was working on the script and language of that. But if you could very briefly give us a kind of cultural background to them as well, now that we've had this information about the political, and then we could just move on and take a few more questions.
Right. These people, the Chakma people actually are of, Sino-Tibetan descent. Okay. And as you have already mentioned that they are Buddhist by religion. As far as the language is concerned, their language is kind of, not very akin to Bengali, but somewhat. It's a different language. So I really wouldn't know exactly about that. What is it called? But it's their own kind of ethnic language. But they are of Sino-Tibetan descent. By religion they are Buddhists, and the Chakmas I got to speak to in Arunachal. While talking to outsiders, for example, they would speak in a language which is kind of called Nephamese, which is a combination of it's actually a local version of how Assamese is spoken in Arunachal, or for that matter in the whole of the Northeast. Other 6 states in the Northeast.
Like you were mentioning, that there is, of course, a sort of a predominant effect of Bengalis or Bengali language, but there is a very strong local dialect that they speak in. And in fact, in recent years, there has been some work that is being done on trying to upgrade it, because now with the digital and with all these keypads and all, so there is sort of some efforts in trying to sort of introduce a sort of more archaic script that was once used and sort of went out of practice. Anyway, moving on, we have would you like to talk about your solution now, or shall we take a few questions and come back to it?
Let's take questions first. Yeah.
So again, you can read it. It's in the chat window. Someone asks that other than the trio of Supreme Court judgments, could you shed some light on how the judiciary, especially the lower judiciary and the executive, has responded to the question of statelessness faced by the Chakmas? I mean, what has been the political position, let's say, from Delhi or from within the Northeast in terms of, I think that's what the implication is, I suppose, of this question. Or has there been any at all? Because I wouldn't be surprised if there was a considerable amount of silence on it as well. Because that's the sense one got in Mizoram. Apart from the construction of the Chakma Autonomous Hill Council, the Autonomous Council, which is in Longtalai, I don't feel, and it was like a very sort of convenient arrangement where it was agreed that they would just sort of stay silently within that space.
No, there are two things to it, Abeer. One is when we look at the whole history of the settlement of Chakmas in Nefa, there was, while Nehru was generous enough to allow the Chakmas to come into India, but then there was also, a very careful calculation on the part of the Indian government then to consciously settle them all in Nefa, not only because it was directly controlled by the central government, but also because of its strategic location, sharing border with China. And let me just, I'm glad that somebody is asking this question. Just a couple of years before, the Chinese debacle, had taken place, and it was just after the Chinese debacle that Nehru's philosophy for Nefa kind of approach, which he had started in collaboration with Verrier Elvin, the famous anthropologist. And that was a good principle. I, as a student of politics, think it was a very wise decision on the part of Nehru. And that philosophy, in essence, meant that given the fact that the people of Nefa, had led a very marginalized existence, historically marginalized existence. Okay. They must be allowed to develop in tune with their own genius. Okay. And there shouldn't be any interference from the government of India. They should be slowly and gradually allowed to kind of, join the mainstream India and things like that. It was a very thoughtful, very carefully thought out philosophy to help the people of Arunachal integrate, with the larger, nation, so to speak. Okay, that's one part of it. But in the wake of the border conflict with China in '62, this particular approach of Nehru came in for serious attack within the Indian Parliament. Okay, and there was raging debates in Parliament that what is this nonsense of kind of allowing these people to is like pampering them. And one member of the Parliament even went to the extent of suggesting that you send 10,000 strong Punjabi men from North India to Nefa and we will set everything right. That kind of absurd suggestions were made. And 2 years later, the Chakmas were displaced and they all came into India. Now here, there's a twist to this story. The same Nehru, who was so understanding of the people of Nefa, thought of using, this settlement in Arunachal, in Nefa, then by settling these people there, to create some kind of a buffer, okay, to use them as a buffer population, right? Basically thinking that in case of future skirmishes with China, since India has done a favor to these people, they could be used, by the Indian government. Now, that was a kind of a calculation which had, taken place. So this is one part of the story. The other is that how has the central government been looking at, the whole issue? Okay. Again, what is needed? I mean, actually, there was a parliamentary committee, which was set up way back in the 90s, actually. And this parliamentary committee had very strongly recommended that the Chakmas must be given citizenship. Okay. The subsequent governments of India, irrespective of which power has been at the helm, has always been saying that yes, Chakmas have a very legitimate claim to Indian citizenship and they must be granted so. Now, the problem is that no government at the center till date has acknowledged that it was actually a mistake on the part of the government of India way back in '64 to have settled these people in a land which happens to be a protected area.
Correct.
Now, yeah. So what is needed, and this will take me to the solution part of it, if you allow me. Please. Or if there are other questions that I can maybe take those questions and then.
No, let's move forward into that. Yes, please.
Okay.
Please.
So basically, the whole thing is that, given the fact that, the local host communities in Arunachal are very clear about one thing, and that is that they are not going to let them live there or not kind of remain in ownership of the land. Okay. That is one part. The Chakmas, again, on the other hand, the same Chakma refugees in Arunachal, they also very clearly say one thing, that look, and particularly the younger Chakmas, the Chakmas who were born in India, they are very clear in their minds and they say that, look, we were born here in Arunachal, or let's say India, and we know of no other home to call our own. So we are going to live here and die here no matter what, right? And they never actually, they never subscribe to this label of refugees. They flatly refuse the term refugee. They say, no, we are not refugees. Let them call whatever they want to call us. Now that's a very interesting point. Okay. And they also clearly refuse to be treated as second-class citizens. Okay. Now see, the whole problem in Arunachal is that if you allow, I mean, the settlement, the settlement of Chakmas in Arunachal, you know, and even if they are given citizenship, for example, each one of them is given citizenship, which they actually deserve and they should, right? It would still not, it would still not grant them, rights at par with the local people. Okay. At the most, they would be treated like all other non-native Indian citizens living in Arunachal, who can never develop permanent stakes within the resources of the state, right? Say, for example, you and I go to Arunachal, we live there, work. We are there only as long as we are working, right? And then we have to come back, right? So it is a very unique kind of a situation. And this is, this is primarily because the Indian Constitution, acknowledges both individual rights as well as group rights. Okay, and I'm kind of tempted to use an expression here, and that is that if you look at the situation, the specificities of Arunachal, it is for lack of a better expression, maybe I can say there is this whole principle of common but different. Arunachal. Okay.
We lost you for a second. Can you just repeat that, please? We just lost you for one.
Okay, what I'm saying is that there's this very unique arrangement because of certain provisions within the Constitution of India, and I use this expression called common but differentiated citizenship. Okay, so the point here is that in Arunachal, if you go by the existing laws, outsiders are not allowed to develop permanent stakes in the state. Okay.
Yeah.
The presence of outsiders is only temporary, right? So the whole problem is that grant of citizenship is one thing, but even if they are granted citizenship, it is not going to help them, right? And the Chakmas also are very clear that they do not at all want to go back to Chittagong Hill tracts. Say, for example, if Bangladesh, hypothetically speaking, if Bangladesh were to, say that, okay, it's going to kind of repatriate all the Chakmas, okay, the Chakmas would still not go back to CHT. And the reason for that is that particularly the Chakmas, those sections of the refugees who have grown up in Arunachal, the second generation, who accompanied their parents way back in 64, and those Chakmas who were born in India, right? They are very categorical. They are very clear in their minds. They don't want to go back to CHT because there is no organic, linkage with that, place. They've never seen that place. Okay. So what do we do now? What can be done? Could something be done? And that's the question that I would turn to now. Could something be done which ensures that Chakmas are not evicted from Arunachal, right? And at the same time, the indigenous peoples of Arunachal can also get their land restored to them. Now that's something which I have been trying to, work on, and it may sound very patchy, but I have tried to kind of, tried to apply my mind to it and see to it that, how can a balance be struck in a manner that the Chakmas get Indian citizenship, they're allowed to live in Arunachal for a certain period of time, and eventually the indigenous peoples of Arunachal also get their land restored to them. Okay, so it would be so that it becomes a win-win situation for everybody. Okay, now what I'm going to suggest here about a possible, solution to the crisis, which clearly appears, irresolvable. Okay, and this is something which is based on, the fact that, I mean, let me put it like this. I basically call this a solution of solidarity. Okay, a solution of solidarity approach to resolving the crisis, and this is premised on the assumption that both the parties, both the principal parties, the refugees as well as the host, and I'm not talking about the governments here, okay, either the central government or the state government, the two principal parties would have to show empathy with each other, and would also need to kind of mutually appreciate their peculiar constraints and concerns, and this can be done only if the indigenous peoples of Arunachal show certain degree of magnanimity. The Indian government gets proactive, and the Chakma refugees living in Arunachal also pragmatically reorient their priorities. Okay, now this is the basic condition. Okay, now let me go about it first. So citizenship, the Chakmas have a full right over it, right, and it must be granted to them in one stroke, as and when it is granted. The Chakmas would all become Indian citizens. Now the question moves to land rights. What about land rights? And that's the most contentious issue in the whole story. Now what I'm saying is that, okay, the Chakmas have already lived in Arunachal for more than 50 years. Okay, let's allow them to live for another quarter of a century, or till the time the second generation of the Chakmas, whose age would be in the range of 50, 55, 45, 55 years, let them live on in the state for another 25, 30 years, for as long as they are there. Okay, and once they are all gone, in the life cycle, that we have, okay, 70, 75 years. That's one part. Okay, as far as those Chakmas who grew up in India and who were born in India, for this section, what the government of India must do is pay them some kind of a refugee reparation. Okay, because the government of India must acknowledge to begin with, that a historic injustice was done to these people for no fault of theirs. Okay, and something has to be done to kind of pull them out of this crisis situation that they have been for more than 70 years now, right? So a huge amount of refugee reparations must be given to them, and the money must be spent, okay, on imparting quality education to the younger generation of the Chakmas, right? Empowering them to the extent that tomorrow they do not feel dependent on the land in Arunachal, and they can take up job in the modern sector of the Indian economy. They are already Indian citizens, by the way, and once they are Indian citizens, they have all the rights to live anywhere in India. With quality education, they can, move out of the state, buy land elsewhere, and not only buy land. All those Chakmas who move out of Arunachal willingly, voluntarily, should also be given, land somewhere else, in non-problematic areas, for example. Even that can be done. Okay, so that is one part of it, right? The other is, what about the indigenous peoples of Arunachal, right? Now, what I'm suggesting here is that the indigenous peoples of Arunachal must also be given or paid what I'm calling, refugee caretaking reparations. Okay, it's these people who have taken care of the refugees, right? Taken care in the sense by hosting them, not that they have helped them in any significant manner. Is the refugees themselves who have looked after themselves. I mean, who have kind of really worked very hard to survive and things like that. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that once the younger generation of the Chakmas are empowered enough, okay, that they can really take care of themselves, having become Indian citizens already, right? They should free up the land. Okay, they should free up the land, because that is a non-negotiable, a claim of indigenous peoples across the world, including India. It's a different matter that the Indian government does not even recognize the term indigenous peoples, right? So that is but there is a movement, building up, gaining momentum in the whole of the Northeast, and people are increasingly invoking this political category of indigenous peoples. Okay, so the whole issue is land rights. Okay, so the land should eventually be freed up by the Chakmas, but that will happen only when they are sufficiently empowered. Okay, for this, what is needed to be done is the need for a quadripartite talk. Okay, a quadrilateral at the quadrilateral level, which would have representatives from the government of India, the state government of Arunachal Pradesh, the leadership of the Chakmas within India, which is, there's a body called Committee for the Citizenship Rights of the Chakmas of Arunachal Pradesh. So their representatives and APSU, they should all meet together and possibly agree to this kind of possible solution, which might help cut through the current impasse over the issue between the Chakmas and the Arunachalis and the central government and the state government. Let me stop here, Abeer, and if there are questions.
Yeah, in fact, I think we've almost exhausted the time that we had. And
Abeer, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yes. Yeah.
Abeer, yeah, this is Aloka from Hyderabad.
Sure.
A very fascinating, detailed and incisive presentation by Dr. Deepak. And he said something very interesting in the beginning. And that is that since there were not many records, he used a lot of oral narratives. And this is like a characteristic of many indigenous communities in the Northeast, that before colonial times, there aren't any records that we have, written records, but much of it is either religious, let's say in the monasteries, maybe in the Chittagong Hills, maybe there would be some written manuscripts and all, but much of it is all oral. So what I really wanted to know is a bit of a flavor of what kind of oral narratives he was able to collect, in particular about the partition period, as well as about the, like the Chakmas are in all the various states, right? Tripura, Mizoram and all. So there is a sense of there being Chakmas across various states, right? So do they have an oral memory, one, about them being one across these modern states, and two, have different experiences about the partition thing? Because in Punjab, Bengal and all, we have been using oral narratives to understand how individual families, individuals, groups suffered things. So what kind of oral narratives did you collect? I'd just like to have a small flavor about that, because otherwise your study, of course, is a fantastic study on how states intervene to destroy people. And that is very well taken. So I just wanted to have a flavor of that, if you could, if time permits. Thank you.
Deepak, just to introduce you, Dr. Parashar Sen is a historian, so her concerns are sort of squarely placed around oral history. No, seriously. It's a panic situation for so many of us. There are various pockets, where you work, where like for instance, Megha mentioned that I have worked extensively around Islam in this part of the mountains, and surprisingly, forget about the sort of any resource. There is no interest in creating a resource in a lot of places. So yes, but let me just leave you with my final question as well, Deepak, because you can decide to kind of wrap it up accordingly. As Dr. Sen is also asking us to look at the sources and the oral histories, and of course the idea of a pan-regional Chakma identity and so on. One of the things that is also a major concern of this platform on which we are being hosted is how does one speak then of such, because again, we without any doubt from your talk realize how so many different aspects of the journey of this community in Arunachal is so pertinent. in so many ways to what is happening to us, to ordinary citizens, not just sort of displaced minorities, but, minority communities, whether they are religious minorities or sexual minorities across the world. Now, how does one kind of perhaps speak about this or bring this into some sort of mainstream conversation, in schools, or, or sort of create so any thoughts of that would be very useful, because we know that a lot of these recordings that we make are eventually for school teachers and history teachers who would be sort of watching them. So it's also always nice to sort of be able to present to them how at a very, rather than not in any way trying to simplify the situation, but in a sort of easier way, how does one approach and enter, and then perhaps introduce these topics at an earlier age to students and children. Yeah, so that would be like our final comment, but please
that's a very difficult question.
Before you go on, can I ask a question? Just a very short question, and
Sure.
you can incorporate it.
Sure.
Fascinating research, absolutely. I got so involved. But
thank
having been to Chittagong and seen the Chakmas there, I would like to know from you, during your research process, did you visit Bangladesh and Chittagong? And could you say why, and is there any difficulty between the two countries? And why are they held back from each other? That's what I would like to know. Why is there so little interaction?
Complex. You suddenly have a mess.
No, I was so very unfortunate, actually, not being able to go to visit Chittagong Hill Tract personally. I wish I could, and I would still, on the first opportunity, go to Chittagong Hill Tracts.
Yeah, do something for them.
Sorry.
Do something for them, please. Also.
Of course. I mean, what can we do as teachers, researchers, except writing about them, talking about them, and we have very limited role. But that's the whole power of research. Like if you take up a problem, research on that problem. If you could provide new insights to a particular problem, come out with possible alternatives and things like that. So that's our limited role to play. But I really wish that I got a chance to kind of
comparative study. I think it'd be an excellent comparative study.
Thank you for that. But I'm sure I would agree with you. If I had, if I had got a chance to go to Chittagong Hill Tracts, it would have really added, it would have added more quality to the work that I have done.
Great dimension to your chapter. Great dimension.
New dimensions maybe, but that is a severe limitation. I couldn't get a chance to.
There's always time and hope.
Yeah, but I'll take Aloka ji's question, and that's a very, very good question that she posed. Like there was a serious handicap as far as I was concerned working on this problem, because I was not familiar with their language, so that being a major handicap. But the advantage of me having spent about 5 years, I was in Arunachal for 5 years, and I had picked up a smattering of Ohomia while I was teaching there, and the Chakmas also speak in that language. So it was like easy for me to communicate with them. And then obviously, I did what researchers usually do, which is taking help of interpreters and things like that. So I did extensive interviews with the Chakma people. I interviewed about 150 Chakma refugees settled in different parts of Arunachal, in all the 3 districts that they were settled in. And since it was a refugee-centric work, like, I mean, in the sense, I was primarily concerned with, capturing, documenting, getting to, getting a hang of what the problem is like from the perspective of the people themselves. I was kind of, that's what oral history allows you to do. You always, privilege the voices of the people. You actually take a back seat, and you, I mean, you kind of always remain in the background. And that's the approach which I have followed in the chapter, which is based on fieldwork, when I'm basically looking at the whole issue from the self-perceptions. So basically, the method that I used was, long interviews with the people, which helped me eventually reconstruct their past as seen by them, right? And oral history is something which basically, relies on people's understanding. The emic perspective is very important here. How people tend to look at their own history. They need not, their story need not conform to objective reality, so to speak, and that's not important. Practitioners of oral history or oral narratives do not, I mean, never subscribe to truth being singular in nature. They subscribe to what is called, plurality of truths, right? So for
collective memory also.
Collective memories, very much collective memories. So all these memories, so the memory was a very important part, right? As you very rightly put it. So I banged upon their memories, used their memories to reconstruct history as seen by them, right? And it's not a question of, authenticity or not, like people's understanding, their narratives are their narratives. So my job as a researcher was merely of one of being a facilitator between not only the Chakmas, not only for the Chakmas, but also for the host community. So that's the role which I'm basically trying to play in this whole work, trying to get, both the sides of the stories communicated, right? So I'm glad that you raised this question.
Thank you. Thank you. Fascinating. And that's exactly why it is important, because on the one hand, we take a state perspective, and then there's a people's perspective.
Exactly.
And there is, as you rightly said, plurality of the way in which memory operates, and a kind of unilinear explanation that we tend to give by using documents and official records. And so I'm very happy that you've given this kind of a chapter, and I'll look forward to reading it sometime. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now, coming to the most difficult question of Abeer.
Yeah, I was just thinking of sort of making it a little easier.
Yeah,
I mean, exact point that we were discussing right now, this last point, and it is something that comes up very often, in the context of historians and anthropologists working in the same area. This idea of plurality, this idea of being able to accommodate multiple voices, and sort of be able to move forward from the sort of sacrosanctness of, let's say, a particular kind of written history. This itself, that's why I said that. I mean, I could draw that out, and perhaps lead into what we are saying, that in some ways, from a young age, and this also ties up to the central remark that you made in your solution, the idea of empathy. Because this kind of work can only stem, you can only perhaps start understanding the plurality of truth and the coexistence of multiple versions or multiple voices only when you can look at them, from that space of empathy, and not from, looking at looking like the state,
Right.
and using a title of a book.
Yeah, please go on. Yeah,
no, that's it. I just thought that, that could be a lead into what is about. How do we deal with young children and history? Yeah.
I'm very glad that you are raising this issue, because it's a very, very critical issue, very important, because the manner in which we, are taught history at the school level is a very mechanical way of teaching history. And history as a discipline has actually has actually, moved miles and miles away. I mean, from where it was until about 40 years back. Okay, new trends have emerged in history. For example, subaltern history. When you look at the whole emergence of subaltern history, that's exactly, I mean, this whole new trend which started, started with the emergence of subaltern history, when, alternative histories, became very significant, and all alternative histories, as a rule, relied upon the voices of the people. I just am tempted of using an example here. Shahid Amin, for example, his all very important work on Chauri Chaura incident comes out with very, radically different understanding of what had actually happened. And that could become possible precisely because the route that he takes, which is oral history, oral narratives, and comes out with, startling revelations about that particular incident. Okay, and it's not what is taught to us.
And
School
Deepak,
yes.
Deepak Shahid's new book on Ghazi Mia is even more relevant in the sense that it's built around a memory, not even a historical evidence that there was a nephew of Muhammad of Ghazni, right? So it sort of substantiates exactly. So memory may not be truth.
Yes. I agree with you 100%. There are numerous examples that we can take, of recent works which have been published in all kinds of disciplines, not only limited to history. I'm just reminded of another great work, which is again done by doing extensive, work. Who is this American scholar? James Scott. James Scott's book called The Art of Not Being Alone. Again, he's a man who kind of does extensive, field work, ethnographic work, and comes out with his startling findings. So that is the power of history. So again, Abeer, it's important to tell our, students at the early stages in life of their, of learning, that there is not only one way of recording history. History is not merely written, right? And what is written is only, one version of history. Yeah, right. So basically, this point needs to be communicated to students at early stages. That we should not unconditionally accept what we are taught, for example, right? Now, unfortunately, we do not do these things at the school level. We do not even do these things at college level, or even at the university level, So, I mean, there is a need for overhauling the entire educational system, so to speak, so that, students know, children, adolescents know that, there's no one story about one thing. There are always stories about one particular thing. There's no one singular history. There are multiple histories. And, they should be left to kind of, take their own call. Now, this kind of autonomy to students, freedom to students, need to be given to them. But for that, we would need to pay very serious attention to such issues, right from very initial stages of, learning process.
So I think we're almost at the end of the time that we have, and our audience has also dwindled a bit, but thank you so much. I think it was an extremely enjoyable session, not just getting to know about the plight of a particular people, but also in the manner in which you sort of illustrated and sort of explicated the kind of issues that we have now repeated a couple of times. Thank you so much. Thank you, Megha, for having us and allowing us to do this session. It is not very often that one gets a chance to talk about this. So thank you so much for allowing me and Deepak to actually do this session for you guys. And thank you so much, Deepak, for taking out time from your extremely busy schedule. And I can understand, this sort of sort of situation that we are all in, where we are trying to take classes and get everything done online, and it's quite a challenge. So thank you, really, really thank you. And it was lovely meeting and being able to talk to you because of this event. Yeah.
I loved every bit of it, Abeer, and I'm grateful to Megha. And actually, I must also acknowledge, I'm also very grateful to Sarit, my friend, who put me in touch with you, you two wonderful people. And I really enjoyed. It's a little funny to be meeting on a platform like this, digital platform. First time we are meeting, that too in the virtual world. But I enjoyed every bit of it, and I wish we had more time. Maybe we could have but it was really good to kind of be able to talk to you, and
we can always fix the time issue with a follow-up session.
Yeah, sure.
Genuinely, we are the ones who should be thanking both of you, because it's really been extremely interesting and enlightening, and also very, very important and pertinent to the work that we are trying to do at the History for Peace project. And I'm also particularly very pleased that with the note that you ended on, because not enough can be said about bringing about a change in the way history is being taught at the school level. And overhauling the education system, probably we will not see in our lifetimes. But at the individual level, whatever we can do, probably at least will, start a certain kind of movement, because there are so many teachers out there who really want to do everything that we are talking about, bringing multiple voices into the classroom and developing critical thinking skills and all of that. But they really don't have the time and the mind space, So it's people like you, when you spare the time and do sessions like this, it helps us also to kind of, then take it a step further and bridge the gap, become the bridge between research, academia, and school level teaching. So thank you very, very much, Abeer, Deepak. This has really been fantastic.
Thank you very much, Megha. I just enjoyed every bit of it. I wish I could have done a better job.
Well, that I don't agree with, because I think it was perfect.
No, but it's perfectly
We will have to now try to get Deepak over for one of our conferences, because I think a lot many
really great. Yes.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
that Deepak brings into the material. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Actually, like Deepak said, sorry, I should say this, that all thanks to Shoritda, because he's the one who first 8 years ago put me, led me to his work, and then now introduced me to him, which is why all of this is possible. So we should all send our thanks to Shoritda, who's actually an amazing and lovely person. Like,
yes,
great.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic teacher. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Okay.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.